What is going on, guys? Thank you for entering the chamber once again. Today we're taking a look at something a little bit more competitive in Black Xeno Trunks. This is a deck that a lot of people speculated as being extremely competitive when it was being previewed and talked about. And after being allowed to sit and simmer a little bit, it's got some recent DBS Fest and other event toppings. I think it got like top 16 at the last card market event. It's already starting to establish itself as a competitive pick. And we're going to go over today what makes this deck so competitive and give you some tips on how to play it and a couple of things you can do when you're playing against it. Before we get started, like usual, we're going to be showing off our custom leader from DavidsonTCG. He does some of the best custom leaders on the custom leader artworks in the game. If you want to make your deck look as pretty as possible, you can check out his website down below where we'll include a link, and you can pick up leaders of your choice. Many of his newer leaders come with optional gold foiling. You can get this both with or without. The gold foilings cost about $39.99, but they are worth every penny. They look incredible on the table, and they really add a lot of character to your deck for your regular games at locals and just playing for fun. With that out of the way, let's talk about the leader. So, leader's front, 10k base body. He does not have an attack trigger. Instead, he has an activate main, where you can send a card from your warp and draw two. This leader really likes going first because they draw so many cards that and can even draw basically cards on their first turn that for them the energy advantage is kind of all they care about. So this is a deck where you really hope you win the die roll. You awaken either at 4 life or less, and that's usually not the target you're hitting, or if you get 5 Xeno Saiyans in your warp. Sorry, 5 Black Saiyans, I guess, but they tend to all be Xeno. Either way, you draw a card and tap an energy, and you awaken into Super Saiyan God Trunks, the Crimson Warrior. This guy gets a brick of effects. On your turn, when he attacks, he draws 2 and warps a card. So he goes from having an activate main to an attack trigger. But getting to draw and then warp means you can make more informed decisions. He has an auto that when your unison gets attacked, he switches back to active mode. He has blocker, so you can then block attacks and to help protect your unison if need be. And then finally, he has an activate main where you can spirit boost and pay 1 and send 2 cards from your warp to your drop and warp one of your opponent's battle cards. So he has a little bit of onboard removal. That effect comes up occasionally, but not very often. Really, Trunks is just a value engine. You draw more cards than your opponent, you see more cards. How you weaponize that hand advantage is kind of what will make you win the game. Let's get into the cards. To start off, we play 3 copies of Trunks, Duty of the Time Patrol. Trunks is our 1-drop searcher of choice, mostly because he can search most of our Xeno Saiyan targets, and he searches our unison. It's very important for us to find our unison by our second turn. This is a 54 card list, so sometimes that can be a little tough, but the fact that our leader draws 2 cards every turn, or I should say sees 2 more cards every turn, plus having a searcher, we can usually find it, but you should mulligan for her aggressively. Next, our other opener, we play a full playset of Son Gohan challenging the Demon God. Gohan is a 10k body that blocks for us if we need a blocker. He's a good body to push early damage on decks where we kind of need to be the more aggressive player, and he plays for a single energy from our warp. So what's neat is that we can use our leader's ability. If we go first, we can use our leader's ability and draw 2 cards and warp this, and then we can play it from our warp, which basically we just drew 2 cards. We just went +2 there. And when this card is played from the warp, you send up to 3 cards from the top of your deck into your warp. So he can also help fill your warp to get you awakened faster. Just an all-around excellent card. We mentioned her being important, but now we're going to talk about our unison, which is Supreme Kai of Time, challenging the Demon Empire. No, sorry, opposing the Empire. Kai is kind of boring as a unison, but she's really important to have in play. Her +1 sends up to 3 cards from the top of your deck to your warp, which again helps you fill your warp. Usually when you play her on turn 2, you'll have like 3, maybe 4 Saiyans if you're lucky in warp. So when you do her +1, you should probably just go 1 at a time until you hit a Saiyan. Anyways, She also has an auto that when you play something from your warp, you draw a card and she gains a marker. So a lot of these other random cards that we're going to go over next, along with the Gohan, are effectively +1s to our hand in addition to playing from our warp. So, you know, you can pay an energy and get a 5k on board, like a 5k combo power, and then draw a card, which is kind of like getting to use an 8 for 1 energy. Really, really potent stuff. Into our other cards that we want to send to the warp, we play a full playset of Super Saiyan God Trunks, Power Awakened. Trunks is a 20k dual attacker that we can pay for 2 energy from our warp as long as we have at least 8 cards in our warp. That's a really trivial thing for this deck to do. When he attacks, we move 3 battle cards from our warp to our drop area to help. Basically, he like helps turn on Overwhelms. Trunks is kind of our main value engine. 20k dual attacker is good at running things down or pushing damage over time. His auto fills our drop so we can then play value-based Overwhelms. And he has one unfortunate permanent where if he dies, he gets removed from the game, which is fine because otherwise he'd be like super recursive. You know, if he gets sent to the warp, he would come back. If he gets KO'd, he gets to the drop, and then you overwhelm it. Like he would just stay. He would never die. So it's fine that he's a permanent that if he gets removed, he gets removed from the game. It's a small cost to pay for a card this good. Next, and this is a card that not a lot of people play within this deck, but I think people should mess with. We play 2 copies of Birth of the Crimson Hero. Birth has technically an ability where you can pay an energy and check the top 5, but that rate's terrible. We're not really doing that. What this card is here for is the second ability, where if it's in your warp, you can put it on the bottom of your deck and then burst a card and give your leader a 5k boost. You can do it to unisons too, but you pretty much always use this for a leader. This is a extra target that we can warp off of our leader, usually off of our leader effects, or it's just effectively like a free good card to hit off of our random mills off the top. This effect has actually been so useful for me in my early testing that I might want to bump this up to 3. Definitely a card that more Xeno players should mess with. And then finally, our last kind of warp target, we play 2 copies of SS3 Trunks challenging a Demon God. Trunks is a 20k body that's incredibly sticky because unlike his Super Saiyan God form, this card doesn't have a permanent where when it dies it goes somewhere. So you can, I mean realistically, like this card, once you find a copy, it's not going anywhere. They warp it, it comes back. They KO it, it comes back. They spin it to your hand, you can get rid of it, it comes back. Like that's why it's unique. Anyways, it's a 20k single strike. Becomes double strike if you have 10 or more cards in your warp. Also not a very hard thing to do in this deck. It does require a spirit boost to play, but our unison gains a ton of markers, so it's not usually a big deal. Into the rest of the battle cards, we do play a thwarting engine. So shockers, we play 2 copies of Vegeta True Fighting Spirit and a playset of Son Goku True Fighting Spirit. These are really useful in the blue matchup, which tends to be one of the tougher matchups for this deck. So this helped us win that matchup game 1. And they're also just good fusion pieces because, spoilers, we play a SS3, SS4 Gogeta thwarting engine like every Black Xeno deck does. These guys both, when they attack, you can take a life, they become 15k, so that's the thing you need to do. Sometimes you'll awaken at like absurdly high life totals where just taking the life might as well be drawing a card. They also have a once per turn auto that punishes your opponent for playing defense. So Son Goku TFS, whenever your opponent activates a counter, they warp a card. That can add up really fast in some matchups. Vegeta has once per turn where basically when your opponent switches an energy to active mode outside of using an awaken skill, they warp a card. That's mostly anti-blue tech, but sometimes matters. We really benefit from them just being 5k bodies, because this means we can use them to fuse with our playset of SS3 thwarting the Dark Empire. I don't know what to say about this card that hasn't already been said in another deck profile. This card's broken. Like, one of the best cards in the game. Even though everyone knows about it and plays around it, like, its raw power and value can't be questioned. It's basically a 1-drop 25k double striker that when it attacks, it warps a card with no downsides. Sure, you have to fuse it from your warp, and that can take a bit of setup, but that's not that difficult in a deck like this where we're warping cards constantly. Sure, it's unique, so you can't have more than one out, but this card would be super dumb if you could have like 3 in play at once. It's basically like a must-run staple. And to complement our SS3 thwarting, we run 3 SS4 thwartings. Since SS3 moves cards from our warp to our drop, we can use SS4 to move them back from our drop to our warp. But realistically, we have a lot of other ways to do that. SS4 is in here primarily to be our core boss monster. He's a 35k triple attacker, and when he attacks once per turn, you warp 2 cards from your opponent's hand, 2 cards from your opponent's board. Their choice for both ignores barrier on board. At the end of the turn, he goes back to active and he becomes a blocker. So he gives you a little bit extra defense the turn you play him. We play 3 because sometimes you can warp a copy early, unfortunately, and we don't have a good way to get these back once they get sent to the warp, or to the drop for that matter. He's sticky thanks to his permanent where he can't be KO'd, so some matchups, particularly against green and yellow, you can stick this guy and he's not going anywhere. There are other decks like blue, black, and even some red decks, even despite his 35k body, where they can clear this guy like it's no problem. So his value is a little inconsistent, but you pretty much always get the warp effect the turn that you play him, and sometimes that plus a triple attacker is just enough. Into our Overwhelms, I'm bringing back a Blast from the Past. I play 3 copies of Demon God Demigra, True Power Unleashed. Demigra is a Dark Overwhelm for 2, toss as long as you have 5 cards and then drop. Pretty easy to set up in this deck. When it comes down, you draw a card and you warp one of your opponent's battle cards. When he attacks, he warps a card from your opponent's hand. You can actually force a lot of cards out of your opponent's hand in this deck between just making them like respond to your plays and fighting them over their board and clearing threats, and then warping cards using both Demigra and SS4 thwarting. So this kind of helps push that effect further. And honestly, we'll talk about some changes I would make to this deck later, but I might lean into the like hand destruction effect that this deck has more, because that's some of the best parts of this archetype, is the ability to just outgrind your opponent over the long game. Our other Overwhelm, we play 3 copies of Super Saiyan Son Goku Beyond the Limits. Beyond the Limits is another 30k beater that comes down for 6 and grabs any 3 through 7 from our warp after putting our entire drop area into our warp. This basically grabs any card that's at 3 through 7, which most notably is either another copy of itself, Demigra, or a SS3 Thwart in the Dark Empire. Otherwise, it's just a cheap 0 mana 30k beat stick. Next, we're talking defense. We play a playset of Pan challenging a Demon God. Pan is the in-archetype Floodgate, and I have 4 here, and after testing, I'd probably want to put this at 3 or maybe even 2, because she honestly just hasn't been that necessary for me, since the defense in this deck is actually pretty high already. But Pan is basically a 1 mana topo, where she costs 1 on your opponent's turn. When she comes down successfully, you warp 1 card from your hand, and for the rest of the turn, your opponent can't attack with battle cards unless they pitch 2 cards every single time. They still get battle cards in unisons, but you know, we have a lot of easy way to defend those attacks typically between our other blockers and just regular defense. Notably, Pan doesn't actually stop the attack, but that's usually a small price to pay for having a 1 mana Floodgate. This is definitely a card I would trim in the future, but you want at least 2 or 3 copies of it. Moving along for talking defense. Oops, sorry about that. We play a full playset of Support of the Dark Empire. We use Support mostly to walk ourselves down from 5 life to 1 life in scenarios where we don't want to combo out of attacks. It gives us a blocker afterwards. This line of negates has been a staple in basically almost every deck that sees play now, as long as it's monocolored. Black having access to their own is nice, and it's particularly nice in a deck like this where we awaken a high life totals and we're trying to play a longer, grindier game. A bit of tech that I've been experimenting with and haven't been too happy with, but it's what I'm currently on, is Minus Ball, specifically Ultimus Minus Energy Powerball. I'm just going to call it Minus Ball for short. This card is a bit of spot removal for random barrier threats. So this can help us out cards like Poutine that can be very difficult for us to interact with otherwise, since the warp effect ignores barrier and you don't have to warp the card that's attacking. You just warp something that's got 15k or less. You can also pay an energy on your turn as defense and use it to get like a 15k boost, so you can like kind of combo with the card if you need like a lot of energy, a lot of combo power. But honestly, neither effect has been that important. I think it's a good cheeky one-up to hit problems, but I would definitely like cut probably one copy of this card moving forward. Next, getting into our super combos. For our black deck, we play 4 copies of SS Prince Vegeta, The Prince Strikes Back. Prince is the best black super combo, not only because it's a bottom one draw 2 super combos, which are generally the best, but specifically he's a 5k Vegeta, which makes him a great fusion target for True Fighting Spirit. That's how come we only run 2 copies of the Vegeta True Fighting Spirit, because the Vegeta is a backup for our Gokus and not something we like necessarily like need to have. Usually it's not too hard to get 1-on-1, and once you have 1 of each, you can make thwartings all day. Moving on to our SCR of choice, we play Pan. Pan's a great generic black staple. It's just good at basically like taking a turn back. Since turning your opponent off of attacking battle cards means most decks can't really kill you. Plus you have a lot of combo power in this deck to survive against, even if they try to like go all in with a unison to push some damage, you can usually fight over pretty efficiently. On your turn, you can also play her just for 0 as just a 40k single striker. Sometimes that's exactly what you need from your SCR. It's just a big body. You could also play, like, for example, you could play Kai in the slot. In theory, you could play Heroine's Lineage if you want like a budget SCR. You can play a lot of SCRs in the slot, but I think for this deck, Pan is the one you want to be on. And then finally, we play a Further Destruction Champa, since we have a lot of multi-attackers that, you know, they attack 2 times, 3 times, they don't have a lot of double strike. So sometimes we just need to push damage. I might actually want to bump this up to 2 because we don't have a way to search it. Sometimes we warp our 1 copy accidentally, and generally speaking, we really need 1 to finish up a game. That concludes our deck profile for Trunks. It's a 54 card list. I think Trunks is a very competitive deck, but you kind of have to play it for what it is and not what you want it to be. Like, some people who pick this deck up complain that it feels like a worse version of Gogeta Xeno, and I think if you play this deck trying to play like Gogeta Xeno, you're gonna have a bad time. This is not a deck you pick up and play where you're trying to win the game on turn 3. You do have games where you end up winning on turn 3 or turn 4, but really you're looking at like turn 5-ish, I think, in my experience, is usually about the time where like you kind of run people down. You're here for a decent time. So you have to play it for how can I put this? You have to play the deck with the intention of going to turn 5. Like usual, we're going to talk about what you can do in the matchup. First, we're going to talk about something that for a lot of decks is a trap, and the leader is kind of built to punish it, but we're going to talk about removing the unison. The deck is less scary when they don't have a unison in play, but this unison will typically come down with 4 markers, because the turn they play this, they tend to awaken, and then you'll play something from your warp, putting another marker on her and drawing another card. So they'll have usually a 1-drop blocker in play. If you attack the unison, the leader will untap and become a blocker, and then you still have 4 markers to chew through. It's usually just not worth the effort. Fighting over the unison for a lot of decks is a trap. If the Trunks player is doing their thing, this unison's going to end up at like 7 or 8 markers after a couple of turns, and unless you have Kai or there's some other, like, you know, maybe like King Cole, there's a couple decks that can maybe do it, but a lot of decks just let the unison go. Don't fall for that trap. Put all your focus on fighting over the leader and the opponent's board, which comes to the other thing. Their boss monster. Their mini boss monster, Trunks. This guy is very powerful, and he helps set up Overwhelms. Whenever they stick one, this thing is priority number 1. If you pass a turn and they get to use like basically 2 uses out of this Trunks, you're losing that game. Like, They get basically a free Overwhelm every time this guy completes like an attack cycle. And it's also just like a lot of value in cards you lose because he's a 20k dual attacker. Like, to avoid taking that damage entirely, it's like 4 cards, which is a lot. And then he sets up Overwhelms, which, you know, then they can warp another card out of your hand. It's just all bad. So, remove this guy any way you have to. He has a permanent that says if he goes anywhere, he gets removed from the game. So, bounce him to your opponent's hand. Shuffle him into the deck. Bottom deck him. KO him. Do anything. He has no protection. As soon as he leaves the field, he leaves play. And then finally, we have to talk about the actual like big boss monster, which is SS4 thwarting. This is the last thing we're going to talk about. Trunks' whole game plan is to stall for time and then hit you with an SS4 thwarting that does a bunch of damage and rips a bunch of cards out of your hand, and you lose the game. So you should try to plan around this card sticking. Honestly, not every color can properly fight over this card. Green has no tools. Like, if you're playing against green, this deck almost can't lose against green decks because this card throttles green players like horrendously. Plus, you can typically draw enough cards to keep up with their hand destruction. Yellow decks, this card can be really difficult for them because they have to put things in rest mode to remove them. And cards that are in rest mode, or I'm sorry, this card while it's in rest mode can't be KO'd. So this card can be a little tough for yellow decks to remove. Blue can bottom deck it, you can God Seal it. Red, if you're playing with the Jiren Unisons, you can use this and push it down to like a 5k with Videl. They're still going to get the effect off, but at least it's only a 5k, so it's not like threatening. It's basically just like 4 energy for the warp effect. And then you can like remove it later or kill them next turn. Black, if you're on black that is in this deck, if you survive because you're going to be super frail, just warp it. The only colors that have like a kind of like short-term stop is yellow. If you have a steadfast assistance, save it for this card because making it come down and rest will stop it from attacking to use its attack trigger. So this is a good card to like steadfast assistance. You're going to need to figure something else out or win the next turn, or else this card's going to eat you alive, but you can lose by yourself that turn. But broadly speaking, regardless if you have a good answer to this card or not, try to set up your hand and board to minimize the impact that this effect is going to have. You know they're going to stick it probably on 4, especially if it's a matchup where the card is safe. They may not stick this against blue on 4, for example, but against a lot of other colors, they're gonna slam this on 4. So try to have some kind of game plan in mind for what you're gonna lose to minimize this effect. This card breaks you in half if you're not careful and you take a little bit too much damage early on, and you're at like 2 or 3 lives remaining, and then they windmill slam this, and you don't have like, you weren't planning on it. This card can break you. So keep it in mind when you're playing against Trunks. That completes our total deck profile for Trunks, both how to play and how to play against it. I think he's a very competitive deck. There's a couple of changes I would make. Like I mentioned before, Pan I could see trimming a couple copies of, and the minus ball has been only so-so for me. I might want to trim that down to 1. I would definitely add like 1 or 2 Warp Kamehamehas and probably like another Champa. And then from there, I want to experiment with this leader more and where this deck can go. I think people are trying to play with this deck against Gogeta Xeno, and those players aren't being successful. If you look at the lists that have performed well at the super competitive events, they're usually not trying to just run their opponent out of the game, but they're trying to grind them out over time. And this deck is great at that. So, if you found this deck profile interesting, or you have some comments, make sure to let me know. Thanks for stepping into the chamber, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care.